Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I'm still kind of shocked that so many of you have come here to listen to me. I don't understand what has led for this to happen at all. Like Sneha said, for about a decade or so, I've been collecting and documenting images of street lettering and signage from across the country, and that's taken the form of a project I called India Street Lettering. And I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do, because I think that will go some distance in you understanding why I even do this in the first place. So I basically work as a type designer and a letterer and a typographer. And a lot of my interest lies in working with various Indic scripts, though a large part of my focus is in scripts that occur in the northern part of the country, because that's where I am from and I read those significantly better. So I design fonts primarily, but I also design smaller groups of letters for things like branding, for things like book covers, etc. And when I'm not drawing letters, I'm usually working on using letters in my capacity of a typographer or of a book designer. I work independently under the moniker Matra Type, but I also work as a senior designer with the international type foundry Type Together. We work remotely, and it's a team that comes from around the world. And apart from working in scripts like Latin, in which the English language is written, we also work in a number of scripts around the world, including Bengali and Devanagari, so which is usually where I come in. I also teach when I can find the opportunity. And every month or every couple of months, I send out a newsletter called I Spy with My Typographic Eye. And the thing with that is for me to basically write about subjects and themes that kind of resonate with me, which come from the fields of design generally, but more specifically from the field of type. About 10 years or so ago, I moved to Bangalore. I had basically gone to Reading in the UK to earn my degree in typeface design, and after that I came back and made Bangalore my home. And it is at that time that I sort of started first collecting photographs of street lettering around the city. It first took the form of a Tumblr blog, if anybody remembers Tumblr. And most of those pictures were taken with like my crappy cell phone, and it was a truly crappy cell phone. And I would basically... Technical problem. No, there we go. And I would basically post them on Tumblr, and I would sort of just tag them with the languages and scripts I saw, and that was basically that. As I started to get a little bit more serious about the enterprise, I started carrying like my camera and using that instead of, just my cell phone. But with that kind of going on, it sort of became a more serious kind of project for me. Like I said, I design letter forms, and I found that when I lived and studied abroad, I had access to a way greater set of resources when it came to looking at and learning about letter forms. And ironically, when I moved back to India, the number of resources I had shrunk considerably. And so a lot of my effort basically went into trying to create resources for myself that I could then look at when I was trying to learn more about or draw letter forms. So this started to turn into a slightly more serious exercise for me. It also did something interesting. It kind of made me a more confident person when I was out and about. I found that when I was outside with a camera, I was a significantly different person than I am when I'm without one. So like just the amount of physical space I occupied on a busy street, or how confidently I walked into an alley where I had no business, it just increased manifold when I was with the camera. And it also just was really interesting. I mean, I just felt a sense of power in being in public spaces with my camera that I had never really felt before. And this is something that it's something that had been on the back of my mind always, but I only thought of really seriously a couple of years ago when the folks at the City of Women podcast asked me what it was like to document street lettering for such a long time. So this kind of played a part in me also in wanting to continue to do this, even though I didn't necessarily always have the time to do it. And eventually, I moved out of Bangalore. I still travel to Bangalore quite a bit, but I was also traveling around the country, and it just made sense for me to expand the purview of the project from more than just one city. So it got a new name, and it became a slightly more sort of, formal thing that lived on the internet, no longer a crappy Tumblr blog. I actually paid money for a URL. All of that happened. And I started to do things in a slightly more organized fashion. So now every picture that I was clicking kind of got tagged with its location. So if somebody was looking at the website and liked a sign, they could in fact go and see themselves if they so wished. I also kind of expanded the kinds of ways in which I wanted to tag the photographs I was seeing, and I felt that there were more stories to tell about street lettering than just what scripts or languages existed in them. So things like, what was that sign made for? What was its purpose? What kind of materials were used to produce it? What techniques of fabrication? But also when I had captured that picture, because a lot of these signs have a way of changing and disappearing and transforming into other things. So that kind of, I started to tag them both. First, I only did it privately, but then also ultimately on the website publicly, just as a way for not just me, but for anyone else looking at the website to kind of, see it with a few different perspectives. So for example, you have a whole kind of battery of labels which can help you navigate the archive in a lot of different ways. Now, before I was giving this talk, I was actually extremely tempted to kind of, for the lack of a better word, finish this website. It's constantly under construction, which means there are constantly bugs. There might be a link which doesn't work. There are always like 500 pictures which have not been uploaded. I really want to change the header into something new. And then I realized that if I were to do that, it was, I would really be presenting a lie, because it would look like that for just the sake of this presentation, and then soon after it would change into something else. And the point of this website is just that even though it exists publicly, it is in some ways a brain dump, and it constantly evolves. So if you were to go to the website today, and I urge you to, you will run into bugs, and I apologize for that in advance. So as much as I love documenting street lettering, it's actually a fairly bittersweet sort of hobby to have. There is a lot of disappointment in the process. The signs you love disappear all the time, and they are pretty much as a rule replaced by something which is really ugly. Like, I've never had it happen that there was a really beautiful sign and it got replaced with something which was remotely nice looking. It's always something awful. And so a couple of years ago, for instance, I wrote this little essay about the signs on single screen cinema halls in Delhi. And the story is like that everywhere, is that the theaters close down and the signs sort of go down with them. So here are a few from Delhi that are still holding on with their last breath. I think it's working for me now. But this one, which was a really lovely sign for a cinema hall called Paras, and it was massive. I think the letters were bigger than like this height, and it was on this gorgeous modernist facade. And I had really wanted to go and photograph it once before it got demolished, but life came in the way, and now all I have is like this completely subpar sort of like, vector rendering of it. Another example is this chemist shop, also from Delhi. It's a really old one, actually. This got set up in 1935. It's called Seelal and Sons, and in fact, it was the first chemist shop in Delhi which would be open 24 hours, which doesn't seem like a lot now. Probably does in Bangalore still, but it doesn't seem like a lot now. But it was a big deal when that happened. And I saw this sign, say, in like July, and got a crappy picture. I went back a couple of months later, and they basically just stuck another one of those flex signs which says Davaiyan right on top of it. So the wood sign just exists underneath it, now just completely hidden by something not half as beautiful. So once again, all I have, horrible vector renderings. So the thing about street signs is that in some places, they become a real identifying factor for a neighborhood, right? Or just like a particular street. So you might I mean, wherever you live, you might think that there is that one street where, for example, there is this really beautiful bougainvillea plant that takes over everything. Or there's a street where a lot of school kids descend, I don't know, to eat ice cream in the afternoon. Once you start looking at street lettering, it can be the same thing. So in my head, there are streets which have that lovely sign, right? There is a street which used to have that lovely sign. And I love sort of making collections of signs which have a really apparent visual identity. So these are from Yelahanka, Newtown. About 5-8 years ago, I used to teach a short elective course at Srishti. Is there anyone here who currently studies at Srishti? No. Okay. So these were all from a small sort of like market next to where I used to teach. And I loved seeing these signs because even though they were clearly not identical, there was a very, very obvious shared design language. So there was really strong use of primary colors, irrespective of what the establishment was. So it could be a tailor, it could be the vegetable shop, a car garage, a mosque, but they all kind of embraced this particular use of color. You see a similarity in how letters have been extruded to make it 3D. You also see that the script letters are in a similar style. The shadows are applied in a very, very consistent fashion. And this sort of really strong identity for that neighborhood barely lasted a year. The last time I went, that Darshini, Matru Darshini was called. I mean, the shop was gone, obviously so was the sign. And my sense is most of these signs are gone except for the one for the mosque, because the mosque still exists there. So I wouldn't be surprised if it has a new sign by now. Another example is this from Udaipur. I was visiting Udaipur a few years ago for a friend's wedding, and I chanced upon this sort of large roundabout in the city. It's called Sukhadia Circle. It's a place that has a large fountain. There are a lot of chart shops. There are rides for children. And so it's the kind of place where families gather in the evenings for a sweet time together. And it was incredible how strong the visual identity of these hand-painted signs in this one neighborhood were. Again, you see that there is a very clear idea of how shadows have been done. You can see that in the proportions of the letter forms, but just also how, the signs are being repeated, once on the top, once at the bottom, and it's all done in a fairly identical fashion throughout. Now, obviously, some of these signs are a little bit better executed than others, but it's hard to miss the fact that they all have a similar sort of point of view. And I mean, this probably is a really great example of what one saw at Sukhadia Circle. And it's not just that you see that the visuals of these different signs really, sit well with each other, but just by looking at a sign like this, you can also make other observations. So for example, so Udaipur is in Rajasthan, and while a lot of people speak Hindi there and therefore use the Devanagari script, there's a strong influence of Gujarati. And you actually see that even in how the Devanagari letters have been written. A completely different example, this time from Bombay, is of Art Deco lettering, all existing within a couple of kilometers distance. So I'm guessing most of you would already know this, but after Miami, Bombay has the largest number of Art Deco buildings anywhere in the world. And if you have just a tiny amount of time to see them, Oval Maidan is a really nice spot to see it, because you've got these two fantastic movie theaters on either end, the Regal and Eros, and then you have these apartment buildings, each one of them in a very distinctive Art Deco style. And, just like Art Deco architecture has these really obvious visual features which identify it. So, for example, you see the vertical bands in Fairlawn, or you see, these chevron patterns which are kind of going upwards in Palm Court, or the very obvious sort of sunburst motif for a building called Sunshine. You also have equally prominent features in the lettering itself, which makes it stand out as being Art Deco. So you'll see that a lot of it is extremely geometric. You'll see that the waist of the letters is quite extreme. So if you look at Fairlawn and the A in that, you see that the waist is really high. For the A, the horizontal bar, but if you compare it with Oval View, the waist is kind of low. You also see a very interesting modulation in the width of letters. So extremely obvious in Sunshine, where the S is kind of so much wider and more elegant than the other letters that you see. And so, I mean, in particular, these are interesting because if you go to the neighborhood, it already feels very visually consistent because there is a single style of architecture that is on display. And having a consistent style of lettering on all of them kind of just adds to this visual aura that that neighborhood enjoys. Yet another example is from Delhi. This is Paharganj. And if you've ever been there, just as night falls, you have these just hundreds of neon signs that light up. They are fairly spectacular in scale. Most of them are vertical and kind of extend for the full height of, like a 3-story building or something. And it's just not something that we expect to see. You think that this is going to happen in Hong Kong. You don't expect it in Delhi. But once you go there, it just becomes such an indelible part of how you sort of imagine that neighborhood in your mind. So, obviously, I'm not the only person interested in street lettering or the only person documenting it. There are designers around the world who do so for their neighborhoods, their countries, the places that inspire them. This is a book by Louise Fili, who is an Italian-American designer. And in this book, she basically captures a lot of street lettering from Italy. I mean, I'm such a nerd when it comes to street lettering that I actually treated this book as a bit of a guidebook. The first time I went to Italy, hoping to spot a lot of the signs that were in the book in, real life. Another example is this. It's a collection of really small books called Singapore Gothic that have been put together by this independent publishing thing called Temporary Press. And they have these 4 booklets, and this one that you see here basically gathers 3-dimensional signs that the authors have spotted around Singapore. Now, it's not just that street lettering gives neighborhoods identities, but if you're willing to kind of dig a little bit deeper, talk to a few people, there are often a lot of very compelling stories that you can find. Sometimes these stories, help you build these historical or cultural threads, but often those stories can also be really personal. So this is a photo studio in Frasertown, and very, very long ago, I lived in Bangalore for about 6 months, and I used to walk to work, and I would pass this every single day. And while I loved the sign, I was too lazy to click a picture. About, I think, roughly 8 years passed before I went back to it, really hoping that the sign still existed when I went back. And to my surprise, it still did. And I kind of gathered the courage to go in and actually tell the staff and the owners, if they were there, that, the sign is really brilliant. And I went inside and I met a Ms. Stella. Her father started this photo studio and named both the studio and his daughter the same thing. She joked about how she's never quite been sure whether she's been named after the studio or the studio after her. And she's not really sure what her father loved more. And she actually pointed out that while this sign that we see, the bright red and yellow one, as beautiful as that is, the sign that you see beneath it, the one with the gray and the red, that's the sign that her father originally painted. And out of respect for him, she had never painted over it. And it's just such a lovely story that just exists on the street. And you'll only find it out if you kind of, look a little bit more deeper. This is a completely different kind of story now. This is a gravestone from the Nicholson Cemetery in New Delhi. And I don't know how much it is visible, but do you guys see this name right here? So it says P. Sweries and Company. And when I saw this gravestone, I was really interested in figuring out who those people were. It seemed pretty obvious that they must have been the folks who produced the gravestone, but I wasn't really expecting to find too much information about them. I was wrong. P. Sweries and Company was started by a Peter Sweries. He was born in Calcutta in 1815, and he started a business to build gravestones. His son was born. His name was Charles George, and he started to work with his father in this business. He was really good at it. He expanded the business from Calcutta to Havra and then to Allahabad. And then he kind of got his wife's brother-in-law to join him in the business as well. And then both Charles George and Peter died. And this man continued to run their business. And he raised Charles George's children. The really interesting thing is that this cemetery is obviously in Delhi. I still haven't been able to figure out why a gravestone was brought either from Allahabad or even further east. I have no idea why that happened. And as I continue to look into them, the name again popped up when I was looking at this really interesting project called the Presidency Plaques Project. A bunch of students in Calcutta did documentation of all the plaques in Presidency College. And the name Peter Swearies and Company pops up again because they were responsible for a number of plaques which exist not just in cemeteries in Calcutta, but also within the university. Now, I'm planning to visit Calcutta later this year, and one of my top things to do when I'm in the city is to just find more things that this small company put together. So again, when it comes to stories like this, there are a number of books from other parts of the world where they capture them. This is a book by a gentleman called Stephen Banham, and he calls himself a typo-archaeologist. And this is a book about Melbourne, where he's tried to dig into the stories behind a lot of the really iconic signs that existed in the city. Another kind of interesting way to look at signage is what material it's built of and what techniques of fabrication might have been used to put it together. So these are signs from Lodi colony in New Delhi. I had some far-flung relatives live here when I was a child, so I saw them all the time and I didn't really care about them. I got interested in them when I was studying graphic design because they were a kind of interesting example of seeing monospaced letters in a really analog way. So monospaced letters, when we are thinking of the Latin script or English, are letters where all the letters of the alphabet have the same width. So if you look at stuff here, whether it's the B or the O, they have to fit in the same width. So the way it works in these signs is there are tiles of a fixed size and everything must fit in them. What makes these signs more interesting is that they're actually bilingual. So it's not just monospaced English that you see here, but also there's text in Hindi, so you see Devanagari. So Hindi, much like Kannada and other Indic scripts, is not alphabetic. It's something that is called alpha-syllabic, which means each unit can have a half letter, a full letter, some kind of vowel sign, another mark. So it's a much bigger single unit. And they've kind of struggled to fit that into, singular tiles. And I've been trying to look into how these signs came to be because they've always been this way in this neighborhood. And this particular housing colony is for government employees, and it was the last one that was built by the British in India before they left. So this is in the early 1940s. And yet I hadn't been able to find a great deal about why these signs, because they don't exist in too many other places in Delhi. And recently, I came across something which might give me a clue. This is a book about street signs in London, and it has a separate chapter about signs in Hampstead, which seem to do the same thing. These are kind of monospaced letters on tiles, and the book not only shows a bunch of examples from that neighborhood in London, but it also shows, a catalog of this company called Minton Tiles that produced these letters, which they called indestructible lettering, and they were the ones who were responsible for all of these letters that you see in this neighborhood. Tiles have been used in a bunch of other ways. This is a collection of images from the New York subway, which has these really, iconic, recognizable, tiled signs inside for wayfinding. But when you think of material, it really can be anything. This is a picture from Ulsur from a couple of years ago. These are letters made of flowers. Again, a fairly unexpected material, but not so much if you're in Bangalore, because this happens often enough. This is yet another sign from, I think this time, Ahmedabad, which I find really compelling because the sign maker decided to basically stick these little pieces of glass, the kind that you put in, like applique and on clothes, on their sign, because this was a store that sold clothes. And so it's a little small intervention with the material which makes, the sign so much more interesting. And when we think of signs in India, everyone kind of defaults to hand-painted signs because we see so many of them, and they are written about, and they're celebrated, there are typefaces that are based on it. But for some time now, I've been trying to think of ways in which I look at them a little bit more closely, a little bit more critically. At a type walk that I run in Paharganj in New Delhi, with all the participants, we play a game of hand-painted lettering styles bingo. So you see all of these various styles and effects that hand-painted lettering usually has, and as we go through the walk, and as I'm talking them through a lot of like historical context and design context, everybody goes around trying to find hand-painted signs which, can kind of, to which all of these factors apply. So here is sort of like a small sort of, showing of what they do see in Paharganj. So one of the most, I believe this is a truly iconic sign. I think no better sign for a dentist has ever been made. That smile. But more than that, this is just such a dramatic, beautiful sign, right? And this sign, I think, pretty much checks most of the things in your bingo if you spot it. And so one of the things that I've been trying to learn more of and look at is, where is it that those who paint signs learn this from? And there's a history of manuals that teach sign painting. So this one is reproduced in this lovely book called Sign Painters, which actually has interviews from a number of American sign painters who do the job today. And at the end of the book, they've reproduced this really iconic sign painting manual, which was put together by a gentleman called Charles Wagner, who ran a school for sign painting in Boston in the early 20s. And this manual was first published in 1926. But that doesn't mean that manuals like this are not published today. This is a manual that I have, which is in Hindi and English, published about 10-15 years ago. I know that a Tamil version of this exists as well, though I've never quite managed to get my hands on one. And it teaches similar sorts of things. It teaches how to draw letters, what implements to use, how you should hold those implements. It teaches letter spacing. It even teaches you how to make letters, on a grid, how you paint them in. And this is another image from A Guide to Lettering, again published in India, which has this lovely instructional page about how to make three-dimensional lettering. So there is a kind of tradition of teaching and learning the ideas that we see in sign painting. And while I don't want to keep talking about, different materials that we see, there are a few that I want to point out anyway. So one is wood, which has to be one of my most favorite materials to see out in the wild. It just has a way of, kind of making the form of the letters a little bit stronger. So if you look at the sign for Bentex Mivia, this is a watch store in Panjim, the fact that this is a cursive script style is actually made stronger by how the wood has been molded to show the letter. So similarly, the first sign which says Mohan, this is, I think, a shop that sells weird astrology stuff. But the knot in the first letter, which is the ma, is just so much more exaggerated because of the material. The last sign here is from Bangalore. It's from GG Whaling in MG Road. This wood sign has been gone for about 5 years, but maybe some of you have seen it from when it used to still be around. Another really nice material when you're thinking of dimensionality and things being tangible is signs wrought in metal. These are all examples from Bangalore. Frank Anthony School, which is, if you're up for a long walk, not too far from here. I think the second one is from Frasertown, and the third one is just a house somewhere here in Indranagar. But metal signs have a real quality in that they play with sunlight, and they create these beautiful shadows which change almost the style of letters. So if you think of the Frank Anthony sign, it's really thin metal sheets, right? But depending on what time of day it is and where you're standing, it completely changes whether it is a sign which is monolinear or if it's a sign which actually has like thicks and thins. And that, I think, makes them really, really interesting and special. And then, of course, there is neon. And I feel like that's a kind of sign that I don't need to really sell to people. Like, I think everybody thinks they're interesting. And even though they're kind of disappearing from our environment pretty fast, there are still a lot of places that you can see them, including in Bangalore. They're more common than you would imagine. And then there is style by now, and if you've especially seen the things that I've given you on your chairs, I'm a little bit obsessed with tile. It's a new obsession. I've just been quite taken by the various ways in which tile can be used to create letters. It's not a material we think of immediately when we're thinking of signage, and certainly not when we're thinking of signage in India. This is a really lovely sign for an apartment building, again, here in Indiranagar. And it also, I mean, the photo cuts it off, but it has a really lovely mural of I think the sun and the moon, and I think there's a horse. Not sure what the story there is, but very kind of, well put together. Now, another way now to look at signs is about what they're made for. And I think in a sort of design world, which feels increasingly templatized, at least to me, it's always interesting to see how someone who doesn't have a professional design education thinks of things. We're told that, if it's a medical kind of establishment, it needs to inspire trust and it should have a certain amount of seriousness. But we also think that for some reason, a hand-painted style with 3 different effects cannot convey that. And it's worth asking why we feel that way. We all seem to think that a sans serif letter can be used to sell everything from clothes to coffee, can go on a hospital sign, can go on a wedding card. But for some reason, this is not as versatile. And that is not necessarily what these letters are, but what we think about them. And seeing examples of these signs in the wild tells us that, I'm guessing at least some of you here are designers, that we actually constrain ourselves when we think of what is appropriate for something. Now, of course, there are certain styles of letters which may be appropriate for a particular function because of their formal qualities. So they may be designed to work well at small sizes, or they might be designed well to work with a poor, in poor printing conditions or in bad paper, and that makes sense. But a lot of times we also conflate style and appropriateness, and that, I believe, is sticky ground. A lot of style feels appropriate because we've seen it again and again, right? So we see fashion magazine mastheads look a certain way, and so it feels that that's what fashion magazine mastheads should look like. But there is really no reason for them to look that way. We just feel that way because we've seen the same thing again and again and again. And if you've had a design education, it has been largely oriented towards the West. The examples that you've seen have come from the West, which means that you've seen a bunch of things which don't necessarily belong to your context, but we've learned that that is what is appropriate. So another example of this is a sign for an optician. I've had people tell me that this is a little bit too flamboyant for an optician, but the question is, why not? Right? Why is that necessarily a bad quality about that? Why can't I look at this sign and be like, this must be a person who's very fastidious. This is a person who went out of their way to choose a sign that really makes an impact. Now, here are some examples of signs for books and stationery stores. Do we feel that they capture what a bookstore or a stationery store should be? Do they look imaginative? Will they inspire creativity? Probably. And yet I don't know how many amongst us who are designers would choose either these letter forms or these layouts to actually design branding if we were doing so for a store like that today. And these are all pictures from the last 5 years. So this is not like the ancient past. These are signs that, actually, no, the last one doesn't exist anymore, that shut down. But the other 2, those still exist. And I don't know, has anyone here seen the middle sign in Bangalore? Have you noticed it? Exactly, yeah, it's an also. It's absolutely brilliant. Here's another sign for a stationery store in New Delhi. And if you just see the sign, you're thinking this is going to be some really posh stationery store. It is not. It's just a really old sign that's been maintained really well. So we also just think of how signs should look based on a very narrow understanding of style, a narrow understanding of what kind of meanings letters have. And if you pay a lot of attention to what you see around you, you might stand to, sort of expand that understanding a little bit. Now, more than any kind of commercial establishment, and this I didn't expect, the kind of science that I've gotten really interested in the last few years is signs and letter forms on people's homes. So this is a sign from someone's home in Frasertown. I want to meet this person. It's amazing. Just the sense of confidence one would need to have their house's name in quite that scale in such a flamboyant style. I don't think I could do it. When I lived in Bangalore, I would go around clicking pictures of house number signs just to see how people have tried to sort of present themselves to folks who visit them. And you just see such a diversity in style, in material, but also in how much it might have cost to put something like that together. But then you also have signs like this, which prevent people from parking in front of their homes, or tell them that they have a dog and they should probably think twice about stealing. But all of these signs on homes don't just tell us about the kind of personality that folks might be trying to convey, but it also tells us a little bit about the message they're trying to convey to someone on the outside. So these, for instance, are meant to kind of tell you, we are rich, someone probably wants to come and steal our stuff, don't, we have a dog. So it kind of tells you a little bit about the neighborhood, right? This is a completely different kind of signs and homes. These are from Kanpur. Again, gorgeous Art Deco buildings, definitely decades past their prime, but unlike the very clearly Art Deco Latin lettering we saw in Bombay, you see extremely traditional Devanagari letters on these signs, and they, at least to me, it is such a beautiful enmeshing of two things that I wouldn't necessarily expect, right? But when you put them together, it works awfully well. I guess I've demonstrated that I love street signs so far, but what that usually tends to mean is that they kind of seep into what I do otherwise. So they seep into when I'm doing stuff for fun. This is an example from maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I drew letters kind of based of street signs for 36 days of type. Sometimes these projects are a little bit more serious. This is a sign from Mapsa in Goa, and it's kind of the basis of a typeface family I'm trying to develop. Hopefully will be finished soon. I've also realized that street lettering is a really interesting entry point for a lot of students when I'm teaching typography and type design. It's a lovely way for them to see how different styles are being used together, but also it's a really nice starting point for them to start drawing letter forms for the first time in their design careers. This is work from a student from Pearl Academy. This is, I think, a student from Noida. So they clicked a picture of that sign, which was clearly in Hindi. They were too afraid to draw Hindi letters for their project, so they tried to translate that style into English. But also, like I was saying, that it's not just that the letter forms on these signs are really spectacular. There's also something to learn from, how different styles are juxtaposed. Together, this is from a workshop I ran for a design studio this year. They're called Three-Sided Coin, and they are remote, but they're based in Ahmedabad. And a bit of what we did was look at street signs and see how we may be able to replicate the typography, not the letters themselves, but the typography in them by using existing typefaces. And if that might teach us a little bit about how we can, use typefaces together in a slightly more inspired way. And then because so much of what I do has got to do with drawing letter forms, I'm constantly looking to learn more about how to draw them. Letters are really kind of funny, contradictory little things. You can kind of stretch them when it comes to legibility quite a bit. So, I'm guessing at least some of us here have really poor handwriting, but people can read what we've written, right? So as long as letters kind of look like what they should, people identify what they are. And yet, on the other hand, if a government decides that a letter has to change, that is actually a really difficult process because people hold these really close to their hearts. So what you see here is this really excellent manual for Devanagari calligraphy produced by this Mumbai-based organization called Aksharai. And I depend on, manuals like this often to get a better handle of how a letter should be drawn correctly. Except it turns out there is more than one way and more than one correct way to draw a letter. This is from just one street in Haridwar. And this is all, I mean, and it's the word Shri, which obviously in Haridwar shows up a lot. But just in this, you can see these are 8 different ways of drawing the same letter. Now, there is, to be able to find this, I have to look at resources which are other than books. It has to be ephemera, it has to be street lettering, it has to be newspapers. And while this kind of tagging hasn't made its way to the website yet, now I'll use this archive a lot to do things like make collections for myself in different scripts. So like Hindi I read, so these I can imagine, but for scripts that I don't read at all, or I read, you know, very little, to kind of learn what the boundaries of the letter forms are in a particular script or language. So like this is a really great example of how wide a letter can vary in terms of its shape, and yet those who read it will have absolutely no problem in recognizing this as the same shape. Now I haven't done one in a long time. I do one tomorrow, but late in the last decade, I started running type walks, and I think they've been the most kind of obvious extension of my practice when it comes to street lettering. So type walks are like these little tours of a neighborhood, with the goal being that we look at them with a typographic perspective, and we make the letters that are in that neighborhood sort of front and center. And what I really like about running them is it's a little bit like visiting a museum or visiting a library, but actually a little bit better than that. Because there are all of these objects that you see, but you're able to see them in context, right? They're not removed from where they were meant to be and what they were supposed to do. And at the same time, you're right there, so you're able to truly experience their material, their scale. If they've aged, you can see that. You can also kind of see how people are using it. And it's a really lovely experience to be able to talk about design in this sort of living, breathing way, rather than doing it using resources and books which are usually quite far removed from the Indian context. So just to give you an example, a few years ago when I was trying to prepare for a type walk, I was trying to look into the history of the ampersand. And this is a really nice book which kind of dates its history from like, I think, 79 AD in Pompeii, and it's showing all of these examples starting from then, going up till the mid-19th century. I learned lots of interesting things in the book. For example, did you know that in Germany, the ampersand is not, in German, the ampersand is not used in running text, unlike English where we use it all the time. But what I also realized that when you live in a place like India, you are taught design almost as dogma that comes from anywhere else. Design happens somewhere else and you learn it. But there is very little that you learn about how any of those things interact with what happens here. So, for example, the pictures we saw of Art Deco houses in Kanpur with traditional Devanagari lettering, that is something that happens here and it has value. And so so these are just examples of ampersands from across the country. So they may have developed somewhere else entirely, but they've been here for a long time. And their interaction with whatever is happening here leads to newer forms and newer styles, which we just never really look at with any kind of, criticality or attention. With 15 minutes to go, I'm going to start trying to wrap up. So the latest thing I've been trying to do to get street lettering to be something that people look at is these tiny zines that I'm guessing most of you found on your seats. My plan with these is to produce them often, and each one of them is basically just meant to be a really thin sliver of what street lettering in India can look like. They're not meant to be exhaustive books which show you all the great lettering in a particular city or a particular neighborhood, but just a very, very particular perspective that comes from, the intersection of location, of material, of time. So some of you would have gotten this scene, which is about azulejos in Panjim. Azulejos are a kind of hand-painted glazed ceramic tile art form which comes from Spain and Portugal. So they make their way to Goa because of Portuguese occupation, and they are extremely distinctive of just this one place in the country. Some of you would have gotten this zine, which talks about how letter forms in two scripts, Latin and Devanagari. One relatively simple, another more complex, can kind of be rendered in the style of mosaic. And some of you would have gotten a zine which was about the monospace style lettering that you see in some of the older neighborhoods in Delhi. You would think that the idea of tile lettering would be exhausted in just these three zines, but that's not even the end of it. For example, if you've been to Gujarat, you would have seen these really nice memorial benches which make an appearance, which have these just one-of-a-kind abstract Gujarati letter forms that are rendered in tile. And I'm hoping that with another trip to Ahmedabad, I'll be able to do a zine dedicated just to these. So yeah, that's all from me. I hope the next time you are really tired of doom scrolling, you will go to India Street Lettering. It ends at some point. There's only a few hundred pictures, but I promise it'll be a more fun thing than Instagram. Thank you.
Hi. Wonderful. Like, I've been following you on Instagram for a while, and now hearing the stories behind all those pictures sounds lovely. So a particular question, actually, especially when you start talking about the tombstone and the story behind it. The tombstone, which it's from Allahabad, but in Delhi, and you kind of dug out quite a bit of the story behind it and the people. And I'm very curious about what kinds of resources exist. Like, I'm sure there's a component of talking to people and like family history, but have there been like other interesting resources to find the story behind the type?
I found that a lot of these stories exist in resources that have nothing to do with type. And that's usually the case. I mean, you're right that it involves talking to people that honestly I'm really bad at. Contrary to what this public lecture will make you believe, I'm very shy and I hate to walk up to a stranger and talk to them. But I've also realized that a lot of stories are found in things which are of that time but about something else altogether. So, for example, a lot of stories that I learned about the science of movie theaters is from books about movie theaters and not books about type. And if I'm interested in learning about neon, the answers lie as much in a chemistry book as they do in a book about pop culture. So I think it mostly just involves, I don't know, reading a little bit more widely and trying to coalesce it into something which forms a more interesting story.
There's a question.
Audible? Yeah. Very interesting, and thank you so much for somebody who is like, we all like photographs of pretty things, and you just showed something which is so more beautiful, which is right in front of us. Thanks for that. Three short questions. Question number one, any aversion towards spelling mistakes which are so fancy when you see letterings?
Actually, I don't mind them at all. I think they you know, it's like how they say if someone speaks in English with an accent, it's probably because they speak another language. I think the spelling errors are exactly like that a little bit. It just means that the person who painted that sign probably writes in another language. I think they're just what they are. I mean, I actually don't think I find them that amusing.
This was because part of photo walks, people used to do photo walks in Bangalore a few days ago, like before the mobiles became what they are. And at that time, some of us, we tried to capture only the spelling mistakes, but we never...
Oh, nice.
But not so nice. We never saw the end of it like the way you did such, like, you know, it's such a wondrous work in terms of the curriculum or the subject or the depth of it. Maybe if I could dig some, I could just share it with you.
Thank you.
The second question is with respect to like the signages or the writings behind trucks, very, very fancy. And sometimes people have had, like, not accident, but they have been driven away or blown away with that kind of artwork as well. Does that come across as something which interests?
I mean, it's definitely extremely interesting, and there's a lot of people who've done a bit of research about it happening both in India, and if you look at trucks from Pakistan, they take it to its logical, most beautiful extreme. I mean, they do truck art, I mean, really well. Actually, just last week, I was attending an online conference where there's a student from Srishti, his name is Rohan, I'm forgetting their last name, did a really wonderful presentation about like vinyl stickers which are stuck on like autos and such, and equally compelling. So, I mean, street lettering is just the half of it, right? You see so many different ways in which people sort of express themselves in public spaces. I think they're fabulous.
Thanks for that. And the last question is, people who did that artwork, any stories or anything about them? Because we saw two sides. One is the audience, one is the owner, but what about the creator?
I mean, yeah, I suppose the only creator sign I had in this was about creators who are long dead, uh, which is my bad. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what kind of story you would like from me, so I'm not sure what to say. But if you'd like, I could share some links and stuff of people who've interviewed sign painters, and I can do that.
Hi. So thanks for the interesting session. And I think just to continue on what he just mentioned, I think I have a list of words that are my favorite misspelled words. And I just
Tell us.
love how few people spell Chinese or few people spell some other, words. So I come from a very different sort of background. I am a designer. But I wanted to understand what made you choose such a niche subject. Because I think as designers, most of us just love doing everything. We want to get into typefaces, we want to get into graphics, we also want to do a bit of interiors. At least that's the story for me. So how do you manage to make such a huge documentation of something that is very specific?
Very, very slowly. Like, I'm not kidding when I say this took 10 years. This actually did take 10 years. No, I mean, and you're not wrong that designers like to do a lot of things. I do as well. Like, I design type, but I also design books. I teach. I clearly waste my time doing this. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just you get interested in something and you do it for a bit. And I've definitely had years when I've barely photographed anything. I've just not felt up to it, and then I haven't done it. And like this, I mean, after the pandemic, just going outside and going to a new place has been so exciting that I have just like this renewed sort of, interest in doing it over and over again. I think it's fine to want to do a few different things, and it's okay if things take forever to, become something that you feel like you could show to people. And even if you don't show it to people, how does it matter? Just do what you want. I do.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. I just want to say your photos are amazing. And
Oh, I wish my photography professor in college could hear that.
I just want to ask ki in America, as you said, ki there are schools to teach how to write on
So I have
this
to say the school that I mentioned existed in the 1920s.
20s, yeah. But what about India? How the people who paint on boards and all, how do they learn? And
A lot of it is through apprenticeships. So you basically learn from a person who already does the job. And that actually remains true for sign painting across the world.
Hi. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you. I have a question about just generally how in sort of the corporate context or people who commission typefaces or these days custom work for specific campaigns or even their brand redesigns and things like that. With you being in a unique position of kind of over the years seeing how this industry is sort of evolving, what are some observations that you think are interesting, and do you see more people appreciating type in a way that with realizing the kind of impact it has, which is not necessarily widely accepted in our context, especially with people signing checks, not really realizing how important these things are.
I think with a lot of commission typefaces, it must be, as sad as it sounds once I will say it, one must bear in mind that a lot of it also has to do with saving money. Sometimes, if you're a large enough organization, it is cheaper to commission a typeface than to buy hundreds of licenses. So, as much as we would like to feel really good about typefaces being commissioned, it might, at least in some cases, be happening because someone wants to save a bit of money. Sadly, what you don't see enough of in India, and there is good reason for that, is like smaller organizations being able to commission a typeface, because I think that's where interesting work might happen, because a lot of large organizations tend to do, just the persona that they need to show to people is fundamentally boring, and it needs to be, because they can't really stand for anything, right? Because they don't. So you see a lot of work, and that's great, because it also means people like me have jobs. But what would be really great is if smaller organizations were able to do that, and that's at least partly why I do a lot of lettering work. because I find that that is something that I'm able to do in India much more successfully because it costs less for someone to be able to do that.
Hi. So I am a photographer and as a hobbyist photographer, and I think the place where I started noticing typography was when I started photographing Art Deco buildings, because typography is such an important part of Art Deco. So I was happy to see that, but I felt one of the places, I don't know what is your opinion on that, is graffiti is another place where writing has a lot of prominence.
It does.
There is, I mean, sometimes the type or the lettering so ornate or so twisted, for lack of better
It's hard
word.
to read, right?
It's hard to read what it is. So have you seen or are you documenting those as well in your archive?
I haven't. And for no particular reason. I mean, it's a really good point that you bring up. I think I have some images of graffiti, but I think I've just never sought them out. And now that you've asked me this question, I feel like I will have some sleepless nights thinking about why I haven't. But I don't have a good answer for you.
Yeah, I have
don't
a
know why I don't do
I have
it.
a huge archive. So if you're interested, I can share that
I-
because I'm interested in graffiti, and
would love to
lettering
see it.
is one part of it. So that's what
So where-
that's what I said, right? I have a huge archive of lettering in
So mostly
so many
English,
different.
but also like in a lot of Indian languages.
A lot of Indian languages also, and also like Urdu, for example. I don't know what the script is called, but Nastalik, yeah. So I was surprised to find some really beautiful ornate graffiti with lettering in Varanasi. A huge mural with Urdu lettering. I'll share some of those with
I
you.
will catch you once I'm off the stage.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful session. Like, I'm a freelance designer based in Tamil Nadu. Like, I have this question. Like, whenever I need new fonts for my design, like I just type style of the font like I like in Google, and there are many English fonts available like in Google Fonts and various websites. Like, but this is not the case for the native languages. Like, I couldn't find any Tamil fonts. Like, there are fonts, but they are like professional ones that they use in newspaper, and there aren't any fonts like playful or like stylish things. So how do you look at this situation? I think this situation is like for most of the native languages, I think.
I mean, it's without a doubt pretty sad. Though, I mean, in the 10 years that I've been working, it's a situation that's also improved. So even just on Google Fonts, you actually do have a number of Indic script fonts now, including some which have a little bit more personality. You may also want to check out the work of a number of like small independent type foundries that work out of India now. So there is Ek Type. I don't know if you know about them. They do these really, really wonderful like typeface families which cover a lot of scripts. So if you're looking at fonts for most major scripts, you'll find something. There is a foundry called Mota Italic, which does a lot of like Devanagari stuff. Particularly, there is a foundry called Universal Thirst. They actually just, I think they've either just released it or it's due to release. They've released a very, very playful, interesting Tamil typeface. So yeah, you might want to just find a few more indie foundries in India. But you're right, the number that you will find in terms of fonts or foundries is abysmal compared to what you see for English. Yeah.
Hi, it was a great presentation. Just a quick question on like you're talking about how enterprises kind of commission fonts and things like that. What's your take on the government? Like in your presentation, you also cover a lot of like small scale industry, which obviously commissions font. But what is the take on like government standardizing font, especially because there's so many languages and every state has its own language? And where do they get their font type from, or is it all commissioned work?
I have to say, I don't think I can think of too many commissioned fonts by our governments. In general, I'm not a big fan of like homogenization across scripts. I don't see the point in it. Particularly, I mean, all it serves to do is for things to visually look alike. And that has very little value when you think about it. Just because two things look alike visually does not mean that they mean the same thing. Does that make any sense? Let me try and think of an example. So just something simple like color, right? Like color means different things in different cultures, right? Similarly, shapes mean different things in different cultures. And just homogenizing scripts, I don't think it serves too much of a purpose, no matter who does it. You see a lot of homogenization of public signs by governments when they're trying to, quote unquote, beautify cities. And I think if we had a show of hands in this room about whether that beautification leads to beauty, I think I could guess where we would go, like it rarely ever does. So yeah, I'm not big on that. And I think at least a lot of like these beautification, homogenization signs you see are made of not the greatest free fonts. So it's not even like the government is really supporting local designers. So, you know, very little positive out of it, in my view.
How much do you think pride or how you come across is really evident when it comes to lettering specifically for shop? For example, that Sial and Sons, one of the first chemists which opened 24/7, and a lot of them you see generally are in English. So, but when it changes to something called just saying Dawaiya in Hindi. So how much do you think, like, how you come across or the amount of pride you have of running an establishment and the sign which you put, how does it really translate? Has it translated over the years when they change the signs?
That's a really good question. I mean, you do see some signs, like, for example, the Stella sign, right? Like, that is a family-owned establishment where there is clearly a lot of deep-seated pride about the establishment as well as the sign. But I guess that just changes from person to person and enterprise to enterprise, right? It may not be in the same hands anymore. It may be in the same hands, but, you know, the guy who's running the shop was forced to do it because his father wanted him to run it. And now he hates everything, doesn't care about the sign. I mean, it happens to the best of us. But I think you're very right about just the idea of pride. I think when you see small establishments like the food carts we saw from Udaipur, I think making that cart look good is deeply tied with the pride that the person who runs it feels about their business. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in pointing it out.
Hey.
Finally.
So I think there's a really compelling argument for the amount of kind of storytelling and history writing that can be done through signage, and Stella's a really good example of that. I'm really curious about the vinyl signage that's now coming in and you mentioned. And this is a project that's been going for 10 years now. So I'm wondering a couple of things. One is if you've seen any differences in those 10 years. One is whether you've started to document the vinyl signage as well. And I'm really curious what kind of stories the vinyl signage is telling as well, and whether it's around the economics of creating signs, whether it's about taste and what business owners feel presents the right kind of, or whether it's also about larger corporate interest in small businesses. I mean, perhaps a few things, but I'm wondering your thoughts, really.
I don't think I have documented a lot of vinyl signs, and it's something I've been thinking about. A colleague of mine is currently working at an archive in London, cataloguing the photographs of this British gentleman called Alan Bartram, who went around England, but also parts of Europe, half a century ago, clicking pictures of lettering. So they have these prints, these black and white pictures, and of the lettering, and it's really interesting because this is someone who's doing a similar thing in a different place, in a different time. But interestingly, he, for example, did not really click any pictures of acrylic lettering or plastic lettering because it was new then. And it seems that he felt the same kind of disdain about it that I do about vinyl today. But as someone studying science today, I wish he had in fact documented those acrylic signs. So thinking about it in that perspective really made me wonder if I was doing the project a disservice by not capturing these vinyl signs. You're absolutely right in that, it does have a lot to do with the economics. They're just so much cheaper and faster to produce. And I wouldn't be surprised if at least some people find them to be more modern. And it's a way to present their establishment as not one that is tied to a moment in the past, but something that is kind of, forward-looking. All kinds of government drives definitely tend to change signs into, flex and vinyl signs. And there, I think more than anything else, it must be about money because it costs so little. It's just that, I don't know, perhaps we are simply not. I wonder sometimes if I see a beautiful vinyl sign and dismiss it just because it's vinyl, or if I haven't come across a beautiful vinyl sign at all. And that might be an open question for everyone here. Can you think of a vinyl flex printed sign that blew you away?
So if I can just add, I'm also curious about that because the fonts that are being used are designed fonts, and that's your
and yet right?
And that's your yeah.
No, actually, it's really interesting. So sometimes I will go to document these signs with my partner, who's not a designer at all, right? So he's just he's the person making sure I don't get hit by a car when I'm doing this, and he will point out a sign and say, "Oh, look, this looks really interesting," and it will be, and I'll sort of dismiss it as saying, "Oh, somebody's just used a font to recreate a hand painted sign." So I realized that even though I'm a type designer, I seem to have this bias against myself. Which, you're completely right in pointing out. But I think it's also just, at least a little bit is about there being a real lack of fonts in Indian languages, so those signs tend to look like really crap. When signs are made by hand, no matter what technique, metal, word, neon, they're able to render text with higher fidelity than what digital fonts are able to do. So I think with a lot of Indian languages, it's just that the signs are bad because they don't render the language and script well. With English, I have no idea why. I guess we just use the fonts that are on our computer, right? And they're not the most compelling curation for making a bit of an impression. They're supposed to be run-of-the-mill that you'll use for everything. So I guess they just lack in personality.
Hi. It was an absolute joy to listen to how you your own story, your own journey, and the various facets of it. One of the things unique, I think, in what you do is how you're engaging citizens. I tag you several times when I see something, and I'm not a designer, but you've instilled that, I in me just by following you and the things that you say. So what really motivated you with this walks, or why are you engaging with citizens who are perhaps not designers or interested in working in that space? What is your motivation?
I think the really selfish motivation as a designer is, wouldn't it be great if more people appreciated what designers did? I think that is a really sort of selfish motivation in all of that. But also, it's just something I enjoy so much. I like sharing it with people. I get a lot of joy out of it. And I think once people, like you said, right, once you get attuned to seeing them, they're just little pockets of joy in unexpected places. And if more people can see them, I feel like that's a good thing that I might have done in this life.
Hi. So I'm new to Bangalore, and I've noticed that at least around the areas where I live, I've noticed a lot of hand-painted signs which also have graphics that are also hand-painted.
Sorry, what?
Some graphical visual representation drawings. So I found that very interesting, and it really led me to think that those hand-painted sign makers are already graphic designers themselves. So what are your thoughts about them actually coming as guest lecturers in colleges and actually teaching type and how to make posters? And that would be a great way to appreciate their work more and to instill that, hand-painted type is not dead. And what are your thoughts on that?
It might be. No, it would be great. But the question is, can we find a fair way to have someone like that come and teach students in a design school? I think that's the more challenging question to ask and answer. What you said about illustrations, that's actually quite interesting, because in this country there's quite a tradition of not just science but also chapbooks and books having both illustration and text, because not everyone can read. So you see that a lot actually in hardware store signs,
Yeah.
where you will see pictures of, I mean, you'll see painted or even pictures on like flex signs of what they sell, because you don't have to be able to read the sign to be able to tell what you can get in the shop.
Thank you.
Hello. In all your travels all around India, have you noticed that a particular group of people or a particular set of people living in a particular region tend to want to conserve their unique personalities through these typefaces?
I mean, in fact, very recently in Mumbai, so there is that organization called Art Deco Mumbai, right, who document Art Deco stuff. A friend of mine, her name is Tanya George. She's also a type designer. She worked with them to restore an Art Deco sign that had been damaged over the years. So there are definitely folks who are interested in restoring and keeping alive whatever we have. I think it's far and few in between, but it definitely happens.
But do you notice like a particular region? For example, I know that Goa has a lot of, or at least whatever I saw, Goa has a lot of. I felt a lot of personality in the different signs and the azulejos and in the way that.
I want to think about that. It always feels like more personality when it's not what you're used to. And I'm not trying to say that Goa doesn't have it. It does. But let me try and be more articulate. So for example, when I first moved to Bangalore, I was really kind of taken aback by the combinations of colors I saw together on the outside of buildings, like really candy colors, which I was not used to seeing. And so I found them like really interesting. But if I would speak to someone who was from here, they didn't think twice about it. So it's also just that when we go elsewhere, we tend to just pay so much more attention to how things look versus, you know, what we do for things we see at home or whatever that definition of home is.
Hey, hi.
Hi.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, like, in all of these 10 years, have you ever come across political paintings, like wall paintings? Coming from West Bengal, growing up, I had seen these very seasonal during election time, like Chinne Bhot Din, like type of illustrations and specifically names of certain candidates. Like, have you come across these kind of things?
And I think I do have some pictures as well. I think I definitely have some from Kerala. I think in my collection that have never made it to the website yet. But no, I've definitely come across them. I don't think I've seen as many of them, especially the kind that you describe in Delhi necessarily. There it's, at least more recently, has just been, you know, railing against whatever is happening. And those tend to get painted over really fast, as they did in Bangalore as well, right? So that's a real thing to go and capture quickly.
Hi. So actually, I wanted to ask if you could throw any light on like the evolution of these hand signs. Like, are there like mini art movements? Like, what influences them? Like the medium does. So hand painted signs are different from wrought iron signs. But apart from that, like, where did these shadows come from? Like, where did these like drop shadows and highlights and 3D
I mean, you see
things?
manuals of street lettering which are 200 years old.
Yeah.
So this is an art like many other that has existed, and they've usually had these effects included in them. I guess it's just a way to catch attention. That's kind of evolved over geographies and time. So a lot of signs you see in India, for example, will take these rules and kind of bend them a little bit. So you'll often see a sign which has more than one point of perspective which clashes with the other one. That, for example, is not necessarily something you see in hand-painted signs in Europe. And a lot is being made of it. People wonder if that's because so much of our art doesn't do that. Like, perspective is fairly fluid. And as long as you can tell your story in a frame, it doesn't matter that much. So I think cultural ideas like that definitely influence how signs get made. But if you ask me for a history of how all of this evolved, I wish I knew.
Thanks.
Any more questions? We have some more time. Maybe one last. Is there one in the front? Okay.
There's one question in the front row.
Hello, thank you again for the lecture. Well, I had two questions. The first, I think, has been a little bit answered. It was on aesthetics. Why, I mean, if in architecture, I kind of understand why new buildings tend to be, in general, uglier than the older one. It's because it's cheaper to build and maybe you can fit more people in the same plot. In signage, somehow I wonder why a new signage in general tends to be uglier than the previous one. It's just a question of taste is going down. Is this trend in simplification of the logos? So you kind of answered this, but if you have something more to say, why not? Second question, somebody mentioned something historical and it reminded me something that I never really checked after I heard for the first time. Maybe forgot, and maybe also I'm a bit of a romantic, so I don't want to check everything on Google, so maybe I can ask you. I remember that somebody told me that in Southeast Asia, most of the scripts are round because they evolved on being written on palm leaves.
Right.
And if you go straight on a palm leaf, you cut it. And is that true?
It is.
Oh, that's wonderful. So if you have something else to say instead of the
I think
like
the first one, there's definitely
barbarization of the taste.
It's also about time. It's much faster to make a sign on your computer and print it on vinyl than it is to build a sign or hand paint a sign. And I think that increases costs as well. And everybody wants everything fast. Not everyone is romantic like you, unfortunately. Okay. But the palm leaf thing is absolutely true.
Sweet. Thank you.
So I'll take this as a last question. Sorry.
Hi. So I was curious, coming from, like outside design, I'm curious how like these, like these histories and sort of trajectories, lineages, I guess, of lettering and of lettering in Indian languages especially, hasn't been documented, or it seems to be, like lacking, I guess, in design education in India. And I'm wondering if the initiative to like fix that, to sort of bridge that gap, should come from designers themselves, or would it involve like more like collaboration with historians and like other sorts of.
I think the latter, because
right.
just like I think I gave a version of that answer maybe to the first question,
right.
which is that a lot of context doesn't come from design, it comes from elsewhere.
Correct, right.
And without that, any kind of bridging of history we'll do will be extremely one-dimensional and possibly wrong.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Pooja, one last question here. And then.
I'm good.
Thank you. Last man standing. Two short questions again. One is, this question probably not comes under street lettering, but just in general lettering. People who have grown up in 1670s rock music and all, if I use the word Metallica, the font with which Metallica used to be written, so prominent, so beautiful, has that kind of also played a part in the kind of designs that we see? As it, like, where does it come from? From the styling book that you showed? Is it coming from there, or is it like commissioned work, or how does that happen?
Are you asking me a specific question about the Metallica logo?
No.
So I completely misunderstood.
It is in, like right now, as we are more digital, we don't see that kind of styling coming out, because at that time we used to buy CDs or see the prints and see the music albums where it would be maintaining that kind of a, it was more like a signage, like a logo or the brand.
Right.
So that styling, does that come from the kind of subject matter expert you are, or how does that happen?
I mean, it totally depends. A lot of musicians do commission artworks and commission album art. So, for example, I recently realized that the type foundry I work for, Type Together, we realized a few months ago that I think Billie Eilish has a bunch of movies about her music, and they use one of our typefaces. And it wasn't commissioned or anything, but it was like, interesting. Or more weirdly, there was a TV show, for example, that came out on Netflix a couple of years ago about a weird cult, and then we realized that that show used one of our typefaces. So it tends to be a combination of, folks commissioning lettering for something like that. You see a lot of lettering being commissioned for movie titles even today, even in our country. But also just designers finding, or even just the artist finding a design that resonates with them. So it works both ways.
Thank you. Just an add-on, does comics also have this kind of a thing? Like if I see Garfield, for example.
There are folks who specialize in making fonts for comics.
Okay. That helps. Like Calvin Hobbes or Garfield, the minute you see, they're very distinct, so you will not mistake them.
There are people who specialize in just that because it's quite a bit different from, say, designing typefaces for a newspaper. They may be typefaces, but they require different skills.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I think that's a good note to wrap it up on. So thank you, Pooja, for your wonderful presentation.